Hello Internet, welcome back to Tromsø Twilight, the channel where I, Vincent, talk to you, the ever-expanding universe about books, movies, music I enjoy, find interesting, or a combination of the two. Today I'm going to be talking about the movie Teenage Sex and Death at Camp Miasma, which is Jane Schoenbrun's third feature film, and I'm going to be talking about why, despite really wanting to like the film, I was conflicted about it and ultimately don't think that it really works. Just to give a brief introduction to the film, Jane Schoenbrun is an American filmmaker. They made We're All Going to the World's Fair in 2021, and then they released I Saw the TV Glow a couple of years ago. And both those films played with nostalgia for media, and particularly cult media, horror film adjacent things. I Saw the TV Glow was very much related to Buffy the Vampire Slayer. We're All Going to the World's Fair was more about kind of creepypasta and horror film adjacent activities on the internet. They're part of a trilogy called the Screen Trilogy, and this third film is the one that engages more directly with horror film. The two lead actors in this film are Hannah Einbinder as Chris, the protagonist, and Gillian Anderson, Billy. A short synopsis: Hannah Einbinder's character Chris goes to a camp where a series of horror films, slasher films from the 80s called Camp Miasma were filmed, and she goes there to meet the original final girl from the first movie, Camp Miasma. She does this because she, as a young queer filmmaker, has been employed to whitewash or to rehabilitate the franchise, which started with a huge success of a first film and then had, like many horror franchises, decreasing returns. And in later years, the first film has also been criticized for being transphobic. And the film gives you basically all this information in a fantastic opening sequence, which presents to you newspaper clippings, merchandise, DVDs, and VHS tapes, kind of showing you the development of the franchise in a slightly satirical, humorous fashion. The narrative style and the editing at the beginning of the film, also the score, is very deliberately calling back to 70s and 80s, VHS horror movies. There's a lot of Texas Chainsaw Massacre about it. There's an element of Camp Sleepaway, which is referred to directly several times throughout the film. Maybe a little Friday 13th. And Hannah Einbinder's character is kind of living in this world. She's obsessed with these films. She's a walking kind of trivia machine about all of these old slasher movies, and she's very excited for her big break to remake Camp Miasma. She meets Billy, Gillian Anderson's character, who's this recluse with a southern drawl, and she immediately becomes enamored of her and wants to cast her as the central character in the new film. So all this is nominally what the film is about, but what the film is actually about is the way horror film works upon our fantasy, interacts with our sexuality, our imagination, forms in some way our subconscious, and ultimately the film makes the case that horror films come from something deeper, some kind of collective unconscious, that there is a type of desire that lurks beneath the surface, and that horror films are one expression, one iteration of this desire. And the film wants to talk about how desire, what Freud would have called the id, is antic, is amoral, and the film wants to talk about how in some way we can't judge our imagination, we can't judge our desires. It comes from a place deeper and it goes somewhere more extreme. So the killer in the Camp Miasma films is called Little Death, which is, a direct translation of the French word for orgasm. And Little Death comes out of the lake with a javelin, a kind of spear, which, is like a penetrative killing instrument. There's a really stylized sequence in the middle of the film, which is supposed to be a section from the original Camp Miasma film, that shows Little Death kind of working his way through a set of campers and killing everybody, what is done with camera angle and perspective is really kind of creative, and later in the film is kind of explained as being the point being that when we watch a horror film, we shift perspective between inhabiting the killer, inhabiting the victim, and also a third perspective from the outside. So what's good about the film? Both the central performances are great. Gillian Anderson does a good job of being this sultry, slightly strange older woman. Karen Einbinder is this kind of cute, nerdy character with a very suppressed sexuality, and their relationship is convincing, I would say. There are some great visual moments in this. Chris is kind of in arrested development. She's basically like a teenager and she loves candy. So there's lots of like, they play a lot with the candy wrappers in the film in a way that's cool. And there are painted sets, which I think is one of the major highlights of the film. These painted backdrops that create this very artificial aesthetic and environment, and also kind of call back to maybe like Hitchcock. They are great, and the sequences, like just with the two of them in front of these painted backdrops, some of those are really beautiful and quite moving. I also think the central thesis of the film is great. We can criticize media, and perhaps especially movies, for breaking social taboos, for challenging our ideological ideas, being too violent, being misogynistic, being transphobic. And in Chris's character, we see how a young woman has used what she calls problematic elements of cinema as a way of exploring her own desire, her own sexuality, the things that maybe are taboo for her. The point is that the very taboo is what makes media potentially subversive, what makes it potentially exciting, and what can give her access to her desire. The central problem for the film, for me, and the reason that I was disappointed even while I was sitting in the cinema, is that it doesn't do any of the things itself that it's praising in the media it's referring to. It approaches the slasher genre with such a degree of ironic distance that it doesn't have any of the subversive, troubling aspects of the genre. There are many killings in the film, but there are fountains of CGI blood that can only really be experienced as parody. So you might smile, you might laugh, but you won't feel any visceral experience. You won't feel any sense of shock unless you've almost never seen a slasher film in your life. The film also kind of criticizes approaching media intellectually and argues for a sense of viscera. You know, Billy, the character Gillian Anderson plays, she says that Camp Miasma wasn't about, monsters and culture. It was about bodies and fluids. But this film is all about ideas. So it's kind of made by the character Chris, this film, if Chris had never gone on the journey that Chris goes on in this film. This film is extremely cerebral. It's very visual, but it's very, very unembodied. In a sense, then, Teenage Sex and Death at Camp Miasma is the opposite of its premise. Another issue that I have with this film that prevents it from being immersive, that prevents me from enjoying it, is that it is so extremely self-referential. Like early in the film, Chris goes into a room and then she says, "Oh, I feel like there should be a jump scare," she says to herself or to the audience. At times there's almost direct address to the audience. I cannot stand it when characters in a film start telling other characters in a film that they are characters in a film. At a certain point you see the artwork for the movie Teenage Sex and Death at Camp Miasma. So there's this kind of fourth wall breaking postmodern self-referentialism which doesn't work to support the thesis. It really undermines it because you can't live the experience of the film as you're watching it, and it also is not thought through well enough. Like in Inland Empire, you have these moments where somebody you thought was a character turns out to be an actress in role, but then that actress is still in role, or she's moving from a film into a nightmare. This film doesn't really have that aspect. It's kind of trying for it, but it doesn't really quite work. And so the whole inclusion of Little Death as a part of Chris's fantasy, which is also an aspect of the movie you're watching, I just think it doesn't land. And it's not helped by the fact that the character of Little Death has a kind of underwater layer that has the most disgustingly ugly CGI, and the contrast of this awful CGI with these beautiful painted backdrops or what at least appear to be physically painted black backdrops, also just for me like weakens the film. There were moments where the aesthetics were fantastic. There were moments where they were just straight up tasteless and ugly, but not in a way that was like tasteless like a slasher film. It was like tasteless like they hadn't achieved what they were going for. The experience of watching the film for me was that it kept losing me, and I kept trying to like it because I have so much goodwill for Schoenbrun that I wanted to like it. And I kept kind of smiling and nodding and laughing along with the film. But that's not the best frame of mind to be in when you're watching something that's supposed to be kind of exploring subversion and horror films and the imagination and desire, you know. Mark Commode, I didn't watch his whole review, but I just saw the very beginning, and he said that it was like a visual essay. I really don't think that's a compliment. Watching this film is a little like reading an essay. I don't know where Schoenbrun's going to go now. They've completed their trilogy, so maybe they're going to do something completely different with the next movie. I hope personally that they step away from this use of CGI and that they maybe try to make their fourth movie a little less didactic, a little less cerebral. I'm going to leave it there because I'm trying to keep my movie reviews a little shorter. Most of the people who I respect who do these reviews manage to keep them under 10 minutes. So I'm working on it. I'm working on brevity. Please click like if you enjoyed my discussion. I'd love to hear from you what you thought about the film. If you've seen it, please jump in the comments and tell me or start a conversation. Thank you very much for listening, and I'll see you again soon.